I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I am your host, David Agranoff, and I'm excited to have a special guest here today, Steve Davidson, who is the co-editor of a book called Sense of Wonder and the publisher of the classic magazine, Amazing Stories in its modern form. We're going to talk about all that in a minute. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, I want to take a second, though, just because it's my podcast, to plug my latest book, too. Just came out, Nightmare City, co-written with Anthony Trevino, my co-host on the Dickheads podcast. So just wanted to put that out there. That's out there, too. So when you go to Amazon to buy Sense of Wonder or wherever you want to buy it, bookshop.org, whatever, pick up Nightmare City, too. But we're here to talk.
Pick up two copies of Sense of Wonder when you do so.
Yeah, exactly. But I will tell people that the Kindle edition is at a very reasonable price right now. I did notice that it's a $4.99 Kindle, and so for those of you who are e-readers, that's an incredibly good deal is to pick up this one. So we're going to talk about Sense of Wonder in a little bit, but Steve, let's introduce the folks to who you are, where your science fiction background, like how did you get in? I know you've been a part of the science fiction community for a long time. How did you get involved with science fiction?
My mother, actually, who had no prior or current interest in science fiction, used to make up stories that were science fictional in nature. To tell me when I was very young. And then in '64, Fireball XL5 hit the airwaves in the United States, and there was no turning back from that point on. I went from Fireball XL5 to Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, to Lost in Space, to sneaking down the stairs at night to watch Star Trek over my father's shoulder in the living room, and on and on and on. By the time we got to the mid-'70s, I was aware of the magazines and searching for fandom. And in '76, it turned out that the chairman of the then upcoming Worldcon lived in my neighborhood. And I got in touch with them and asked if they were looking for people to help with the convention. And we had a meeting, and I was brought on board. Spent almost every afternoon over. It was Don and Grace Lundry who were the chair people for that con.
So which con? Where was this?
SunCon in '77. It was in Miami.
Miami. Okay.
At the decrepit and bankrupt Fontainebleau Hotel.
So you're a lifelong Floridian then?
No, I am from this was in Jersey. The convention.
Oh, okay.
What happened was that the original committee basically fell apart. And it was almost, 77 was almost a year without a convention. It was the first one that was run by an entirely remote crew. The big committee and everybody working on the con was primarily from northern New Jersey and New York, Brooklyn, etc. And while it's considered to be not one of the greatest world cons, the fact that we actually pulled it off and persevered and had one, we were able to hand out the awards. We hosted the second to last Hugo Awards banquet ever held, which I managed. And it is considered a fair piece of fanish history.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting that it was done remotely. And so you're from New Jersey. You grew up in New
Yeah,
Jersey.
I grew up in New Jersey, and this was in the 70s, remember? No email, no computers, no,
Exactly.
everything was done on an IBM Selectric. And if you go and you look in the program book, the membership list, most of it was typed by me on an IBM Selectric in the Wondry's house.
Interesting. Well, that's fun. Who won that year for best novel? Do you remember? Or
No, I don't. I know that the guests of honor were um oh God, now I'm going to start having word recall
well,
issues.
I do have
Jack,
this, so I could look.
Jack Williamson and Bob Nadel was the fan guest of honor. And the interesting bit of history with Bob is that the first conventions I ever went to were the second New York City Star Trek convention.
Okay,
And
so I now know who the winner is. It was Where the Late Sweet Bird
yes,
Sang by Kate.
by Wilhelm. Yep.
And great nominees though. We had Frank
Yep.
Herbert, Children of Dune, Man Plus, Frederick Paul.
Yep.
Yeah. And Silverberg and Handelman. So good year. Good year. So
yeah, it was. Where Late the Sweet Birds Sang was a bit unusual because it was a novel win for a female author back then. And so, fandom pretty much has always had that sensibility. It's just it didn't have much chance to express itself. But Bob Nadel, to return to Bob Nadel, so I went to the second Star Trek convention in New York City. And the following year, I went back to the next one. But at the next one, I had already become jaded with Star Trek fandom. And the straw was now I'm 15, 16, something like that at the time. Two adult males, both dressed as Captain Kirk, with water pistol phasers, having a fight in the lobby over who the real Captain Kirk was. And it was not a fun fight, it was a serious fight. And at that point,
right.
I picked up my bag of goodies from the dealer's room and walked out of the hotel. And fortunately, I had also gone to that year's Philadelphia Star Trek convention, and they had all kinds of announcements for PhilCon coming up. And I went to PhilCon and I found my fanish home.
Right.
Bob Nadel was there. Bob is he just died recently at 100 or 101 or something like that. And he was a member of First Fandom. He was at the first Worldcon in New York City in 1939. And he would have tables selling pulps. And I met him at that Philadelphia convention, and he spent, in between sales, he must have spent a good half of that convention explaining all about fanish history and the history of the pulp magazines and all that other kinds of stuff. And I was just overwhelmed and hooked at that point.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. And you said he just recently passed away?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he did. He lived in Maryland. He was a member of the Baltimore Science Fiction Society, of which I have a lot of friends in too, because a regular go-to con for me for a number of years was Balticon. And he was frequently there. He actually provided me, he didn't give it to me, I had to buy it, but he went and sourced and found my copy of Amazing Stories Volume 1, Number 1, for me to purchase to add to my collection.
Wow. Yeah. Number 1, huh?
Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool. Wow, yeah. It's interesting because this year, well, every year now we're losing some of the greats of fandom and of course the writers, just recently losing Ray Nelson and Greg Bear, and I think that's a good reminder why, and I think that's one of the important things that you're doing, and it's something that I obviously take seriously, which is learning and teaching the history of the genre. And it seems like that that's a good part of your mission with bringing Amazing Stories back. How did that happen
Well,
for you?
I was working as a intellectual property portfolio manager at a company that made paintball gear and less than lethal weapon systems, protein products. And I don't know about you, but somebody says, hey, we want to use this name for a trademark for this product line. Go and check and see what complications there may be. So you have to go to the USPTO's website and you have to research and see what's done and whatnot. And that can be an extremely boring but lengthy task. So to keep myself jazzed and interested, I would frequently go and search for trademarks that I was interested in, and Amazing Stories was one of them. And I would go and I would check, and Amazing Stories was still held by Hasbro, still held by Hasbro, still held by Hasbro, which was a long chain of events in and of itself. And then one day I happened to do that search again, and it came up and it said that the trademark for Amazing Stories that had been held by Hasbro was dead, meaning it was no longer a registered trademark.
Now, so Steven Spielberg being involved with the TV series didn't affect you guys on that, or is that a separate?
No, that's actually an interesting part of the story, which, if you don't mind, I will get to in train.
Okay? Yes, take your time.
So my wife was also working at the company at the same company at the time, and I called her over and I said, Karen, could you read what that says on the screen? Because I thought I was in a dream or having some kind of bizarre hallucination or something. And she said, Amazing Story is dead. And I said, okay, we're going to have to talk when we get home tonight. And I explained to her, I mean, she knew of my involvement with science fiction, but she wasn't really up on the history of the magazines or anything like that. And I explained, and I told her, I said, look, I write the application, so we don't have to pay an attorney to do it. I do the search, so we don't have to pay an attorney to do it. It'll cost a couple of $100, and I'd like to register it. And then that way, at the very least, I'm sure that at some point in the future, we'll be able to resell it to somebody in the science fiction field and at least recover our investment, if not make a little money on it. And she said, yeah, sure, no problem. So I went and I filed the application, and I was informed multiple months later that it wasn't being granted because there was another application that had gotten in ahead of mine by less than a day. So I called up my attorney and I said, what do they want? They wanted, the USPTO wants to know if I want to drop it or let it sit. And my attorney said, well, you know as well as I do that most trademark applications eventually fail for one reason or another. Let it ride. So we let it ride. Took 10 months. And then I was informed by the USPTO they had one minor office action. I hadn't done something like saying that I wasn't claiming the word stories or something like that in the trademark. And it granted. And this was started in 2008, concluded in early 2012. It was granted. And in that intervening time frame, I had gone and talked to people and lined up some potential investors and whatnot to bring the magazine back out. And by the time that it finally granted, for a variety of different reasons, all of those investors were gone.
And as that happens to be usually, yeah.
And so I was perfectly content to let it sit until I had a chance to work on it and figure out other things. And also during that time, I had put together, you asked, what the purpose was of all this, what my goals were. And essentially, I had put together what I called a social magazine. The idea was to tie the magazine to social networking with some changes to social networking that would encourage a fanish type of interaction between people. And that was what I mostly needed the money for, was to build the social networking engine that did things differently than Facebook and Twitter and all the others. And about 6 months in all that, I started getting emails and phone call from people and meetings at cons and whatnot. When are you going to do something with the magazine? When are you going to do something with the magazine? And on and on and on. And finally, I talked to Kermit, who was doing the back end for me. We met through Bud Webster, who's also sadly gone. We were both friends with Bud, and Bud put Kermit in touch with me. And my connection with Bud was that he was big on anthologies, and I also have a fairly extensive anthology collection. So we got together and decided that we could do some stuff effectively, but that we were going to have to bootstrap the whole thing, chop it off at the knees for most of the variety of things that we wanted to do right out of the gate. And so we put the website together and then launched basically as a multi-author blog on the subject of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. The vision initially was always trying to create a watering hole for fanish interests.
Right.
We never quite achieved that goal, and I don't think that anybody can, because of the various changes. Fandom is not the way that it used to be, and neither is the market or pretty much anything else.
The world is very different these days. Yeah.
And every year it's even more, one of you mentioned history and whatnot, and how important it is to fandom and tradition and etc. And what I like to say is that history is our only accurate way of judging how the future is going to look. And by ignoring history, we're taking away our only available tool for judging how people are going to react to various things, changes, etc., etc. And the environment these days, in many respects, seems to come across to me as a very strong rejection of anything considered traditional, especially if it is associated with the baby boomers, who seem to be taking a major hit. A group that I am a member of. It doesn't seem like I can open my mouth about anything without basically hearing, yeah, okay, boomer, and we don't listen to you guys because you ruin the world and blah, 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 kind of. And it's really sad.
Well, it's funny, as somebody who, really enjoys the history of the way back science fiction, which I do, I like looking at, look, there's times, especially like when you read Gernsbeck's introduction to Claire Winger Harris's story in Years, a great example of like, whoa, 1927, what the hell are you thinking?
Right.
But at the same time, like, I appreciate and understand, like, I try to divorce myself from like, this is the way things were then, but it's a milepost of how far we've gotten, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And but I also think that I really there's the scene in the new Kate Blanchett movie Tar, where she's talking to a classical student who's disavowed everything by this work of a composer that, because of their problematic behavior or whatever. And it's a really interesting scene, because I look, I know Asimov was handsy and gross and did gross things, but the work is the work. And at a certain point, like, to me, like, we have to I don't want to not talk about the history of the gross things that happen, but at the same time, like, we want to learn the history and see the progression, and that's one of the things that, and wasn't trying to make a segue, but that's one of the cool things about Sense of Wonder, is that it's a new, like, we can have all the histories that we want. We can have the David Pringles, we can have the Damon Knights, history of Barry Malzberg wrote a great history of the genre and Breakfast in the Ruins. But what's cool is this book is entertainment as well as history, by looking at something that I would never have known about. Like, I would never have known that Hugo Gernsbeck did this story contest, for example. So why don't we, I mean, I don't know, we can still talk. I don't know if, I think I understand where you're coming from on Amazing Stories. It just seems like it's really cool that you're carrying on that tradition. I'm sure you feel a real heavy weight doing that, right? I mean, like,
Well, again, one of the reasons that I wanted to get the trademark was because that I knew that I would treat it in a fanishly responsible manner. Even if that was selling it to another publisher who would do a better job than I could of bringing out the magazine, it would be done from within the sensibilities of being aware of the history and the import of the magazine. Whereas the person that was in line before me, if their trademark for Amazing had been granted, there would be now a series of Canadian travel books out underneath the name Amazing Stories.
yikes. Yeah.
And you also wanted to ask about Spielberg and whatnot, so let me cover that real quick, and then
Sure.
go on. That's all right with you?
Yeah.
The magazine was sold by Ziff Davis to Ultimate Publishing, Saul Cohen, Ultimate Publishing, who was responsible for all the reprint magazines that the then new SIFWA took issue with, got him to agree to pay reprint fees to most of the authors, even though he did have the rights to reprint them without having to pay any fees, but it helped SIFWA get started. And then Saul Cohen sold it to TSR. TSR was purchased by Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast was purchased by Hasbro. So Hasbro owns the trademark. Hasbro has an interesting intellectual property history. They will not sell to anybody, they will not license to anybody, but they will allow intellectual property to lapse if they feel that they don't have any more interest in it, which is how come I was able to get a hold of it.
Right.
So that's the chain of how we ended up with it. I forgot what the other
Spielberg. But Spielberg in the 80s makes Amazing
so
Stories.
when he did the show in the 80s, they licensed the name from TSR. They paid $100,000 for an annual licensing fee. And the magazine itself, other than printing on the copy on the cover now, a television Steven Spielberg television series, absolutely no connection between the show and the magazine, none whatsoever. They then came back to me to say that, to assert that they were going to send me an honorarium for having maintained the name, but they did not feel that they owed anything in terms of a licensing fee. And they asked me if I had an attorney. And this is literally how I said to them that I did. Why, yes, I do. Because they were trying to snow me. The person that I was talking to on the phone presented themselves as a production assistant. It was the head VP of NBC Universal legal department. They absolutely assured me over the phone that Spielberg was not involved in this new iteration. And of course, he was. The explanation for that was that if I knew Spielberg was involved, I would ask for too much money. Let's put it this way. I didn't get nearly as much as TSR did.
Right.
They put out 6 terrible episodes. We have renegotiated the contract once, and I just decided I'd had enough, and I just put an end to our latest attempts to force a renegotiation we served them over 2 years ago. We served them with a notice of breach and termination for non-payment of funds, and they finally 2 years later got around to getting in touch with my attorney to ask for a copy of my W-2 so that they could send me the fees that they owed me, which of course means that if I accept those fees, the contract is back in effect. I have no doubt that they will breach it again. So I don't really have too much worry, but I really should not have ever licensed them to begin with. The threats were, well, we'll bring the show out anyhow. You don't have enough money to sue us. You know, it was just a really, don't ever work with fucking Hollywood if you ever have the opportunity to. Do not do it, because they will screw you over.
Well, and the show that they made just kind of disappeared too. Like
because
it's
the only reason why they came to me and the only reason why they did that show was so that they could have the name in their intellectual property portfolio. That's the only reason.
interesting. Yeah, because six episodes and it disappeared, and it's
And you want to know something? Spielberg does not understand science fiction. He understands parable, he understands allegory, fable, and fantasy, but he does not understand science fiction.
Well, it's interesting because well, one of the reasons why the 80s show worked is that Richard Matheson was one of the story editors. So
but go back and watch those episodes and you tell me how many of them are science fiction.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's more of a fantasy show. Yeah, agreed. I will agree with that. All right, let's talk Sense of Wonder, because and I
that's
already
what we're here for.
Yeah, this book, for those watching on YouTube, and you reached out to me, and because I had been doing the 1930s podcast series, and you said that hey, these might be of interest to you, and they were, because obviously I want to know about 20 science fiction as well, which there's a lot less 20 science fiction than there is 30s.
Oh,
30s
well, absolutely.
Right. And but what year did Amazing Stories start? And let's talk about Amazing Stories in the 20s.
1926 was the first issue of that magazine. However, several years before, and now you have to understand that Gernsback was pretty much of a phenomenon. He started a magazine called The Electrical Experimenter shortly after immigrating to the United States from Luxembourg. He brought a new design for a dry cell battery with him that he got a patent for and attempted to sell to industry, which he figured would make his fortune. Unfortunately, it proved too difficult to market, too expensive to market. But in the meantime, he made some friends over here, and he discovered that while there were a lot of new radio science enthusiasts in the United States, there were very few opportunities for people to obtain the hardware that he needed. So he started with a catalog of sourcing radio and electronic components from Europe to sell to hobbyists in the United States. And then he established an entire pulp magazine publishing empire. He did the first television broadcast with new technology from the Empire State Building. He put out one of the first handheld transistor, it wasn't a transistor at the time, but a radio kit, and was almost brought up on charges of fraud because nobody believed that a radio could be built so small. But he demonstrated that it worked, and so he avoided the fraud charges. And he made his fortune with that. And prior to that, when he was living in Luxembourg, he developed an interest in what I suppose you would call scientific romance at the time. You know, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and various other authors, and very assiduously went around and tried to find similar tales in other languages and whatnot. And so he had a fairly decent background for fleshing out the magazine, and had used those stories to develop a definition of what at the time he called, and it's virtually unpronounceable, scientific fiction, which is a portmanteau of scientific fiction.
I always thought people said scientific fiction, like just as one thing, but
Now,
yeah.
if you pronounce the way it's written, that's not, but the fans started calling it STEF, STF, which was the abbreviation
Right.
at the time, not SF at the time, and STEF pretty much stuck so that nobody had to try and pronounce that name. I have
Right.
it on
And
my,
then eventually, I think Don Wollheim was the first to put the word science fiction on the cover of a book.
no, actually, it appeared on a copy of the 1930s copy of Wonder Stories magazine.
Okay.
And it had been in a poem from the 1800s, I think 1858 or something like that, as a description of certain, basically of scientific romance, but it never entered common usage until the Gernsback era. So
Right.
he had all these magazines. In Science and Invention, he would run some scientific fiction. He had some authors who he basically almost, you'd consider them to be staff writers who did various scientific adventures, kind of like Tom Swift type tales. And in 1923, he sent a letter out to all of his subscribers saying that he wanted to do another magazine focused on just that scientific fiction stuff. And it would have been called Scientific Fiction or Sci-Fi Fiction. And he got absolutely underwhelming support from his constituency. So he tabled the idea, although that same year Weird Tales hit the stands. So he was right that the market was ready for that kind of a magazine, but he just didn't feel that he had the subscriber support to do it. And in 1926, basically without consulting with anybody, as the story goes, he just said, all right, we're doing Amazing Stories. And out it came on the stands. And you have to understand that, again, this is in a time where you could not advertise your new magazine on television. You could not send out a mailing list electronically.
Even radio at that point, really.
Right, right. And so if you look at that cover, it's this neon yellow depiction of Saturn in the background. It depicts Jules Verne's story off on a comet. It's a bunch of polar explorers ice skating on one of the moons of Saturn. But the thing was, you could see that magazine cover sitting on the newsstand from a mile away. The guy knew what he was doing when it came to marketing, and I like to say that basically he engaged in social networking before there were electronics to use for social networking. His radio magazines sourced a lot of its content from the subscribers because they were all hobbyists.
Right. Well, and that leads to Sense of Wonder in these story contests because it's obvious that Gernsback was looking for a way to, I need more writers. I don't have
exactly
a pool of science fiction writers, so I need to do this concept. I didn't realize it was so early. It was in the first year of the magazine.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Here's a real sad thing. So the prize money, $500, is enormous for the time. But it's also sad because you publish a short story these days, there's no way you're going to make $500 on a short story. And I just submitted something to McSweeney's, and I'm not saying I'm going to get published there, but McSweeney's is one of the biggest magazines in the world, and the publication is $400. It's less than that,
right,
from 1926. So
he paid anywhere from 1/4 cent a word to 2 cents a word. 2 cents a word was the epitome of author pulp magazine pay back in the time. And there are stories of authors like Walheim and Pohl and whatnot from those early days. They would write one and place one short story, and they had their budget for the month. So that'll give you some idea of how out of whack things are now. Because there ain't
Right.
no way, there ain't no way
Yeah.
that
So
you,
so he had to find a way to find new authors, and so this contest idea. How many issues in was this first contest? It had to
um,
be some,
he announced it in December of 26 issue,
okay,
and the June 27 issue published the stories.
right, and so he had so there's like one piece of art that you had to go on to base the story off of, but once the stories were published, he commissioned more art to go with them. Is that how it
No, the
worked?
story, it wasn't, the first one was not, well, the first one was a creative story based on this illustration. And so
Right.
was the second one. I'm sorry. You had me for some reason. I got a little confused there. But yes, then he went to his in-house artist, one of whom was Frank R. Paul, and the other one is Lost to Time, if it wasn't Frank R. Paul. And they did illustrations for most of the stories, which is one of the traditions that we carried forward with the new version of the magazine. Every single story begins with a title page, with an opposite title page. It's a full page illustration for that story. And then some of them highlighted pieces, right, might
And so this
have,
was the one that he used for the first contest for those on YouTube.
right, yep,
Yeah. And it's got like a floating, like looks like
sphere,
almost Titanic, and it's got these aliens. And so then there's other illustrations that use these same aliens that go with the second and third place stories. And
yep,
that confused me a little bit when I was first looking at it. I was like, wait, are they writing based on there's another piece of art, but it's the
no,
one that started it.
right. And then the stories were done for the issue of the magazine, the illustrations,
The illustrations were done to go with it. Okay,
right,
yeah,
right.
right. It
Now
in
the other thing, and I noticed that these stories were sourced from two contests. One of them was amazing, and the other was Science Wonder Stories.
right.
In 29, Gernsback lost the magazine and his empire to bankruptcy. Some think it was a forced bankruptcy. The stories are a little shrouded in mystery, but nevertheless, within less than a year, he was out on the stands with Science Wonder Stories, a competing magazine, and at the time, Amazing, Science Wonder Stories, and its companion Air Wonder Stories were the only three science fiction magazines on the stands. Um, Weird Tales was out. I think at the time, the other one had died at that point.
Yeah.
Thrill Book had died at that point. But
Who ran Amazing Stories when Gernsback was gone? Like, who did they hand it to?
it was an editor, Tremaine, hired by the people on it. Your names are escaping me at this point, but bottom line is that the people who forced the bankruptcy were pretty much also handed the what's the word for taking over something in bankruptcy? Um,
The merger, or
you're no
yeah,
when you're appointed, we'll call it the executor. When you're
the
appointed the
executor. Okay.
executor of handling a company in bankruptcy, um, and he was another pulp magazine empire, publishing empire kind of a guy, and they brought in an editor and just continued the magazine.
Right. And well, God, it's interesting because so Gernsback then like has to like recreate his whole thing with somebody else. I didn't realize Gernsback was as much of a kind of a known celebrity type guy, and I also didn't know that he was doing like the electronics magazines as far back as 1908. And
Oh yeah,
yeah,
oh yeah.
so
Well,
that's that. I learned that reading your book. So
thank you. He later on he was considered, he was nicknamed actually by one of the people you mentioned earlier, um, Malsberg, not necessarily Malsberg specifically, but discussed it as Hugo the Rat, Walheim was the one that nicknamed him that for not paying for stories that had been published. Walheim at the time, and I greatly admire Donald Walheim, and I think that his contributions to the field are pretty much
Here.
unparalleled if you go and you study them. But he was also at the time running around attempting to establish himself as some kind of king of the science fiction clubs or something like that.
Right.
He and a couple of his partners pretty much destroyed every other club that was out there, as long as it wasn't beholden to his group. But he did say one thing that I think was very important to the foundation of fandom, and an aspect of fandom that is sadly being lost. And that is that when Gernsback from Science Wonder magazine started to establish the Science Fiction League, which was a corporately supported international group of affiliated science fiction clubs, Walheim went in and basically took over the Brooklyn chapter, I think it was, and ran it into the ground, eliminated it. And at the time, he basically said, and I'm only paraphrasing here, that science fiction clubs are not for serving the purpose of any commercial entity. They're for all the individuals. And it was from that particular fight that the idea that fandom is a non-commercially based entity, we're not in it for the money kind of a thing, was established. And that sadly is going bye-bye. I think it was one of the pieces of glue that held fandom together, was that we were all there to do it on a volunteer basis, without any expectation of compensation for the work that we put in, and that kind of a thing. So that's what happened. The SFL went bye-bye, and that ended pretty much Gernsback's direct involvement with fandom. It was diminished slowly over time.
Yeah, and Damon Knight wrote about the incidents that you're talking about in the Futurians in his book. It's kind of hard to find book. But if people want more details or more coverage on Don Wollheim, we interviewed his daughter, Betsy Wollheim, on the Dickheads podcast, and I highly recommend that interview. It's one of my favorite episodes. It was the first interview we did during lockdown of COVID. So we were getting used to doing Zoom, but Betsy was great and really like detailed a lot of, she knew a lot of the history of her father's time. And she also flexed majorly when we talked about her father corresponding with Lovecraft, and she like literally pulled out letters. So that was pretty cool. Fun moment on our podcast. So that's the Dickheads podcast, though. So, but yeah, I agree with you. Don Wollheim was incredibly important. But getting back to these contests so Gernsback had to build up these the readership, and there are a couple examples of people. There's like 2 or 3 that actually went on to have careers. And write classics, and we'll get to that. But his system he had all these honorable mentions. And it's interesting because the honorable mentions is how he can get out of paying people and still publish a story, and then people are going to be like, oh, I got an honorable mention, I got published. That being said, for me, the first contest, which was based on the art that I showed a little bit earlier, the first place story. Let's talk about the first place story, the visitation, because I think what people look for when they read such extremely out-of-date science fiction, at least for me, when I read something from the 20s and 30s, I like seeing what they got right, what they got wrong, what was ahead of its time, and there becomes this like third zone where science fiction that was when you have somebody from 1926 or 27 trying to think about the future, the far future, you get this kind of third surreal reality. And The Visitation is a great example of that. And it's a really cool story. What did you think when you when you unearthed these? I guess I should have said, what was your process in unearthing these? Because
well, I didn't have to unearth them. It was a simple process of saying, okay, well, you know, when we were putting the book together, we were looking for something unique that we could publish, that the content of which would not have a high cost.
Yeah.
And these are all in public domain. And I went and I researched, and I found out that nobody had ever collected all of the stories that had won these two contests.
Right, which is amazing.
And I was like, nothing for nothing, but they ought to be collected together in one place.
Absolutely.
Even if it's only a resource for people who are studying the history of the genre or whatnot. So since they had already been published, and they were self-identified by being first, second, third, or first honorable mention, fourth honorable mention, whatever, I didn't have to read a bunch of fiction and make choices.
Right. It's already
published. It was already selected.
Gernsbeck did that for you.
Yep. Yeah, actually he did. That you have to remind me the first story
The Visitation by Cyril Watts, and this one has the SS Shah of Iran.
Right, and being picked up and deposited by some
in the middle of a lake. It's a cool story. It's kind of a first contact story too.
Yeah. Now, the first thing that I found really fascinating about that was realizing that it was written at a time where it was entirely plausible that there was an area somewhere on the earth that this other race of people could exist and be unknown.
Right. Very good point.
And I was reminded while reading it immediately of one of my favorite older stories is Weinbaum's A Martian Odyssey. And he references.
And Weinbaum died very young. He only got to write a little bit of stuff.
Very, very young. Yeah. And mid-career, we have no idea what he would have accomplished, and it's a major loss. But
Robert Bloch wrote a lot about it because he looked up to Weinbaum like in the short time that he knew him.
Right. But it's an alien on Mars and an astronaut from Earth. And Mars has an atmosphere that can be breathed with some preparation by humans. And he's trying to communicate with this alien, and he references, I forget the name right now, but a tribe of people from Borneo who have particular unique aspects to their language. And he references Borneo in such a way as if you realize at the time that is still, for want of a better phrase, considered to be deepest, darkest Africa. It's some place about which on the earth about which we have no real knowledge. And it's just fascinating to me that there was a time within the sphere of science fiction where that was still a possibility. We lived on a world that we did not know that much about.
Like we do today, yeah.
Like we do today, yeah.
Yeah. No, and that is a cool thing about that story. And here's the thing about the first contest versus the second contest. The first contest, the word limit was much bigger. And I think Gernsbeck learned from the first experience, like maybe that's a little bit too much, because some of the writers who were less professional, a little bit more amateurish, it makes the reading of those stories, like the ones that aren't good, it makes it a little bit tougher because you're like, oh my God, how many more pages do I have of this?
Yeah, there's a lot of that creeps in. Sorry.
Yeah, no. And so what I'm going to say is that, and there's nothing wrong with that, because, good, bad, or ugly, like these stories like are important for their historical significance. So sometimes you're going to trudge ahead even on the stories that you don't like as much. And for example, like the second place story, I wasn't very into. And I admit I did some skipping and some moving around, but like, but the but there were still interesting things in all the stories. And for the second contest, he made them much shorter, which made them much more palatable, because even in the ones that I thought were failing a little bit, I'm still going to read every word because like it's shorter,
only a few
right?
pages. Yeah,
And
yeah.
I don't feel like as a commitment. Now, to me, it's funny, just my personal opinion, the best story that I read in the collection was the third place story in the first contest. And this coincidentally was from the only author I'd heard of before.
Right.
Well, no,
Well,
I think I'd heard of Charles Tanner, but I had to be reminded. Like before, when I looked at the book, I didn't remember who Charles Tanner was, and then, like as I was like, oh yeah, he was a Weird Tales guy. I know him.
well,
But
he also wrote Tumathak of the Corridors, which was a great inspiration to Isaac Asimov.
yeah, yes, and I have not read that yet, but I added it to my list just this morning.
Well, you're
Uh,
lucky there are sequels.
Yeah. And but Claire Winger Harris was one that I was familiar with only because she had one of the standout stories of The Future is Female,
Yep.
edited by Lisa Yazek, The Miracle of Lilies or Miracle of Lily. I'm not sure which, but anyways,
I've got it if you want me to pull it.
well,
So
I have it here too. I could look, but Miracle, that her story in The Future is Female, which was also from the late 20s, is, I think it's from 1928, is one of the best stories of that collection, which is a really, really good collection.
yep,
So, she's a quality writer.
yes, she is.
And
And she had a couple of collections out during her lifetime, and then during the great 60s and 70s, ignoring women in science fiction things, she kind of fell through the cracks and disappeared somewhat. Lisa's done a great job of resurrecting and underpinning the actual history of women in science fiction.
yeah, shout out to Lisa, who we've had on Dickhead several times, including an episode about that book, The Future is Female, so people can find that episode too.
Yeah.
But Claire Winger Harris, I think one of the things about what's another thing that's interesting about her appearance here is that Gernsbeck has a very backhanded introduction to her story,
Yeah, yeah,
where he basically says, as a rule, women are not good scientific fiction writers, but this is the exception to the rule, and then goes on
yeah.
to say some really nice things about the story. But he starts with this like completely sexist insult at the beginning.
Well, remember, this is 1927.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And in
And
my review of the book, I said, "Wow, 1927," because
yeah, but the default assumption of most men and most women was now, and it was an acculturated thing. It was a thing that any female who was heading in that direction was probably heavily discouraged from being involved with, and ran into all kinds of institutional blockages. But the fact was that men were still beating their wives and getting away with it scot-free back then, because
right, yeah, no,
it was not considered to be a bad thing. That
yeah,
was
this is
just the way things were.
yeah, this is pre Lee Brackett. This is pre CL Moore. She was, yeah. And I don't know what her history was or how she got interested in science fiction or moved it forward, but I now have a project to learn more about this writer because she's 2 for 2 for me. And I thought to myself, like, I'm probably gonna like her story, but it's probably not going to be as good as Miracle of the Lily, because like how could she, like,
the first story be
yeah, and then because being that this was her first attempt at a story or whatever, but it's really good. And some of the it's an end of the world story, and it has like this really cool scene where the oceans start receding in the Pacific.
Right.
And yeah, and there's some really cool stuff. Because part of it, yeah, and the scene in the Pacific takes place in the way future of April 1945. And it's a cool, yeah, it's a cool story. And she also talks about there's a transatlantic plane called the Pegasus.
Yeah.
It has lots of cool, neat things. So, and of the longer stories, it's the one that flowed the best,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that
It had most sophisticated use of language
absolutely, yeah,
of any of the others. I think the vocabulary was much wider than any of the others. This was a woman who, if she had been born much later in life, probably would be one of our leading authors, not necessarily in science fiction,
yeah,
but in general. Um,
yeah, absolutely. And so real trailblazer, and really important. And if nothing else, um, her inclusion in here is a historical part of this book to
and
begin
and
with.
I also wanted to point out one thing about Gernsback's introduction. I think it's an indication of his character that he went and wrote that introduction the way that he did. He didn't have to say anything other than, here's a story from a woman, hope you think it's as good as the one written by the men, or something along those kinds of lines. But he took the space to set her aside from the crowd and point out that that story was special. Now, we wouldn't consider it to be reasons that are special now, but back then that was really bucking the trend.
Right. And the only thing that I would really say is wrong there is it should have been number one. But that's just my
Well,
opinion.
now, and I have oft in my mind, honestly, you're absolutely right. I have often speculated that had she not been a woman, or if it had been submitted under a man's name, chances are very good that it would have been picked as the first place story.
Yeah, I agree with you. And or a name that, just like CL Moore, or they can't tell the
Right.
difference.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that being said, CL Moore didn't try to hide her gender. She was trying to
No.
hide the fact that she had a second, that she was moonlighting um from her bank job. So,
Yeah.
and so did you have a process of like, because you have a section on where are these writers now, and that because a lot of them were just non-professional writers, is probably you
One
probably
and done. Yeah.
yeah couldn't find them at all, right?
No. No. Could not find hardly anything. I mean, I wasn't going to spend 4 years down at the Library of Congress doing heavy, deep research on the people that there wasn't something relatively easily available. That wasn't this kind of book. If that was this kind of book, I'd still be working on it.
Right.
But I wanted to try and give a little bit of a background on each of them, so that if people wanted to find more stories by them, they could do so. And sadly, the vast majority of them just, they entered this contest. They probably did so on a one-off kind of a thing. Writing turned out not to be their primary interest. They got into the contest. They had a little thing to share with their friends. Hey, read my story in Science Wonder Stories or whatever, and off they went with whatever other careers that they established for themselves.
um it's funny too, like you can see like one of the writers, Cecil B. White, like was an astronomer,
Yep,
and
and
it says here that he wrote a letter criticizing a later Claire Winger
yes,
Harris story.
yes,
And
and and she sliced and diced him in her returning letter
yeah,
comment.
yeah, and yeah, and that's cool. And one of the things we've talked about, like the online debates that go on nowadays, like, they were doing through the letter sections in these magazines, and we talked at length about that in the Weird Tales episodes in the 30s series. So, and you probably have a lot of fun reading those letter sections when you go back to these old issues, right?
In some respects they are, in some respects, like anything else that's that old, they can be painful. You know, we had the benefit of knowing what happened afterwards.
Right. Right. And seeing who was right and wrong about a lot of these things. Yeah, because sometimes, you know, the science can be really ridiculous, but then other times, even when they're wrong, you can be impressed with, like, for example, like I was reading Judith Merrill's Children of Earth, and like, you know, the science in it is not like hard sci-fi, but there's things that I was like, oh, they knew that about Pluto then, you know, that's
Right,
interesting, right? And
well,
so part two with the shorter, like, for those on YouTube, this is the cover art.
Science Wonder Stories.
Yeah, and
Yep.
it has like a spaceship and the Eiffel Towers floating
With
in orbit. And is that the Woolworth building? Or?
Yes, the spaceship with tentacles. We're
Right.
grabbing souvenirs from Earth.
Right, and you get $300 for winning this one, but
Yep.
you only get like 1,500 words this time. And yeah, and the winner is Charles L.R. Tanner.
Yep.
Who went on to be a regular in Weird Tales. So he was one of the probably the most successful writer out of all the
Out of all of them, yeah, probably.
yeah, and because he wrote a classic which you talked about, which Isaac Asimov is listed as one of his and that's called the
Tomb Attack of the Corridors.
right. And Asimov has listed that as a major influence. So and he was in the kind of the Lovecraft circle. He traded letters with Lovecraft, which is kind of funny because his story is called The Color of Space.
Yes.
Which a lot of people like makes them think of The Color Out of Space, which is not exactly the same title, spelled differently and 2 years earlier. So from 1927. But the Tanner story is really interesting because it's about like kind of anti-gravity devices.
Yeah, a couple of the stories from that second contest were, if you look at the color illustration, what you know, you're going to go with something like that.
Yeah, and
you got flying saucers pulling buildings up off of the Earth.
right, and this one has kind of Russian. His story has like Russian scientists and you know, in the I think the anti-gravity machines, and I think there's something about when they're talking about, there's a funny line where he says something like, oh, when they find your building, deposit it on Venus. You know, really great stuff. Tanner's story is one of my favorites. I got a real kick out of this one. And it's funny because I didn't recognize his name at first. It just was familiar to me, but I wasn't sure when I read it. And then I was like, man, this guy's good. I bet he did something else. And so then I immediately went and Googled him. The second place prize winner is my third favorite story in the whole collection, which is The Relics from Earth by John Pierce, who was apparently didn't go on to be a writer, but he was a well, no, he wrote a nonfiction book about hang gliding, I think.
Right, and his son is J.J. Pierce, who is an editor in the field now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, and his story was an attempt to be hard sci-fi. How much of it holds up or not is kind of the fun. It's an early space travel story, and if you think about at the time, like, space travel was decades ahead. So like, it's funny, I think there's a line where he says something about like traveling inside the atmosphere, like it was like that was just such a
they knew so little, you know. And
yeah, in this oh wait, no, that wasn't the story. No, that wasn't Pierce's story. Pierce's story was the post Exodus. People have left Earth to go to Triton, and they're coming back for their buildings that survived. Is Pierce's story. Yes.
That's the relics. Yes, yes, yes. Relics from the earth.
I'm confusing them. The traveling through the atmosphere is the Tanner story. I'm confusing them a little bit, but the
It's
relics
been a
from.
while since I've reread my own anthology, so you'll have to forgive me.
Oh no, I totally get it.
But I did want to make one little side point here. You know, we've discussed a couple of times the difficulties of reading older fiction, and
Right.
a lot of the ways that people disparage the older science fiction is to say, oh, what, they didn't even have computers in their story. And
Right.
I find that a little problematic. And I put the responsibility back on the reader, because if you're reading science fiction and fantasy, it's presumed that you have some degree of an imagination.
Exactly. Like I
And
hate
it,
when people are like, the Klingons didn't have ridges on the original series. It's like, well, update it in your head. Use your imagination, people.
right. And the way that I just dismiss all of that is to say they're in an alternate reality, and for one reason or another, they decided not to develop electronics the way that we did. Let's move on with the story.
So one of the interesting ones too is there's a story called Cosmic Trash that was the first. I don't
Yeah,
know
the Bob Olson one, right?
Yeah, so it says Bob Olson was one of their popular authors.
Yep.
Did Bob Olson went on to a career, right?
He
Like,
wrote several more stories. He was featured in the magazine on a regular basis. I didn't see anything that indicated to me that, well, and now his Cosmic Trash story, I believe that's the one with the trick ending of it was all a dream.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, well, and that was so weak. I couldn't believe that he got away with it even in Gernsback's time. But
Right.
I haven't read anything that's of any great literary merit beyond the one that won the contest. But he apparently resonated. You know, the playfulness that he had in the story was obvious. He was treating everything lightly, and I think that playfulness came through to the readers.
Right. And I think the stories in the second half are a little bit more fun just because you can relax a little bit and just kind of blow through them because they're not as long. And
Yeah, yeah.
and so me personally, I like the second half a little bit better than the second
Okay.
contest. Although my two
So
favorite stories.
you would have been picking science wonder stories up off the stands instead of amazing.
Right, right. Well, I'm not saying I didn't like, because my favorite story was in the first
Right.
section, but my number two and my number three were in the shorter, and I had more like I had to read in bits and pieces the first half, whereas each of the stories I just plowed through real quickly, and then I read the second half in one sitting, like,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
very, very quickly. And so um
I
because
had it.
that's the thing, is that just mentally, like, I was like, if if it's a stupid concept, I'm like, well, whatever, it's another page and a half. And then I'm more amused by it, whereas if I'm reading a stupid concept and I know I've got 30 pages left, or
It's
20
kind of,
pages
yeah.
left, I'm going to be like, oh my god, get on with it.
Well, you know, I grew up believing that if you picked up a book and opened the front cover, you were obligated to read it all the way through to the end.
Well, I try that theory, and then there's Stephen King's Fairy Tale that came out this year, which I just could not.
But
I love Stephen King. I made it about 200 pages into Fairy Tale and was like, nope, nope. Life is too short. Um, I cannot. I
if you
cannot
ever
deal
want to
with it.
have a ranking on Stephen King episode, invite me as a guest, because I'm not really a fan. Um, but I'm one of those kids that did the library thing with the rocket and planet sticker. Anything in the library that had that sticker on it was good to read, and I started at the A's with Abbott and Flatland, and worked my way all the way through to Zelazny.
Well, it's
Um,
funny. I have one of those rocket stickers on my first science fiction novel, Flesh Trade. And what happened was I was at the library and I saw the librarian putting one of those stickers on, and I asked her for one. I said, "Can I have one of those so I can put it on my science fiction novel?" And she laughed, and I was like,
I
I
hear
want to
you.
have one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And so it's right there on
nice.
my copy of my first science fiction novel. And so here's the thing: Sense of Wonder. So I'm gonna to kind of tie this together. It's interesting because one of the things you guys are doing is you're finishing or you're doing new stories in the Edmund Hamilton's Captain Future,
Mhm.
which was a staple of Amazing Stories, right? If I'm correct,
Oh,
like
Captain Future magazine, 1940s.
okay,
But
it,
but but he was all over all the other magazines with stories of super science, astounding stories, amazing, and all of them. He was a well-known name, and so that magazine, even though it was a little juvenile, got fairly decent circulation and popularity for a time.
yeah, and so what I think is important here is who am I pitching this book to? Well, I'll tell you, I'm pitching this book to um anyone who's interested in the history of science fiction and academics who want to know, because I think this is an important chapter in and I'm not just saying this because you're on the other end of my Zoom, but I just that's what I think is really important about the book. I'm not saying that, and this because you didn't pick the stories, but the stories are of a varying quality, but that's not the point. The point
No,
of the book is documenting this important thing that Gernsbeck was doing to build. It's an important piece of how he was building science fiction in the
and how the genre got started,
Yep.
and the concept of we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, this is the
Well,
first generation of giants that everybody else is standing on the shoulders of.
and these
Uh,
are people coming up with ideas for science fiction stories with less than a year of the first science fiction magazine in existence,
yep.
and just all they've got is the H.G. Wells, the Jules Verne,
Well,
excuse
they
me.
also unfortunately have Gernsback's own Ralph 124C for One Plus, a
Yeah.
romance of the year 2660 or whatever the heck it is, where he attempted to provide a working example of his definition of the genre, which has three parts to it. It's got to be entertaining, it has to be scientifically based, and it's got to extrapolate from scientific knowledge of the day into some kind of a future, which not all these stories have necessarily done, but
Right.
they had at least two of the three elements. And for the first several years, the bottom line is here, nobody knew what science fiction was when these stories were being written. They had a handful of examples. They had when this contest came out, they had 8 issues of the magazine on the stands, April through December, and people were no doubt familiar with both Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, but nobody had bothered to put these together and collect them and say this is representative of some kind of a new fiction genre, and it has a definition and it has rules that need to be followed in producing more of it. This was all before any of that happened.
All right. So listen, Steve, you are an awesome guest,
Thank
and
you very much.
you've done a really great job selling this book. But and I know I'm gonna want to talk to you again about
Okay.
other issues, history of science fiction. So we'll talk again. Um, you got
I
a
wanted
lot
to
of books
thank
back
you for
there.
getting the book up on what was it?
Goodreads. Yeah, you
Yes,
got to go
thank
there
you.
and add because I can't edit it because like it would be.
I that I'm sorry, but that website totally mystifies me. I can never find anything that I am looking for. I can't figure out how to do anything on there, and
I
I'm
will send you a link because I just need. But you as the author, you have the ability to add the
put a
cover
yeah,
because I
yeah.
screwed up because I added it, but I didn't have the cover saved in my files yet, and so I that was my fault. But here's the thing: I have to ask before you go.
Sure.
All of those books on the shelf, and look, we managed to do this whole thing and not argue about Avatar. That's great. Um, But
it's no longer an argument. It's now guns and howitzers and
we'll take it out on paintball field someday, maybe.
Yep.
But here's the thing, like, it's all those books back there. Who are the 5 authors that you consider your favorite?
Not do it. No, won't
Can't do it.
No, no, it's not that I can't do it, but my 5 moves through a Heinleinian tesseract and is 500 by the time we're done.
Okay. All right. Well,
I am primarily an older science fiction and a newer science fiction kind of guy, but I don't disrespect any of the stuff that's out now. There are some great strides that are being made. There's some directions it's going in that I don't personally appreciate all that much, but you know,
yeah,
that's what art is. You can't walk into a museum and love every single picture hanging on the wall.
no. Well, that's true. And I try to balance myself by reading new and old, like, to a certain degree. But I'm a retro guy too. Like, I'm a John Brunner, Philip K. Dick. Like, those are my and I'm beginning to the Lee Brackett is becoming one of my favorites, like, more and more. The Big Jump was my retro read of the year last year, and
Okay.
yeah, and I appreciate all this stuff, and I think one of the main reasons I ask is I want people to discover these authors. But but then again, if you made it this far in this interview, then you're somebody who's into the history already. So we don't need to convince you. But Steve, it was awesome having your. I really appreciate. I don't know if people will say this to you often, but the way I feel about you taking on amazing stories is how lucky we are that the confluence of events happen, that you're a person that's interested in trademark, that through the paintball thing was, and had the fandom, and how lucky we are that you of all people ended up with amazing stories.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And checks are also appreciated.
Yeah. Books, buy books, and subscriptions to amazing stories and all that.
We've actually dropped a subscription, and
Okay.
Kermit, I had a pull out, and a real brief update on this is that I could not handle the day-to-day of amazing stories anymore. And after a little bit of discussion, Kermit said that he was willing to take it over. He's doing that now with my full and complete blessing. And he's going to take the website in a slightly different direction again, that I agree with. And so look forward to that.
Oh, cool. I'm hoping that means nonfiction content, like on a
There
regular.
will continue to be nonfiction content, and I will occasionally go on there and write a rant about something that's pissing me off.
And I'll argue with you about Avatar. It's okay. We'll get through it. But
yeah, but you already gave Cameron your money, so you're lost.
oh, dude, yeah, he got my money. But hey, he made Aliens, and I was in. See, the thing is, I was in 6th grade when I sat there and watched Aliens.
Oh my God! Must have had a huge impact.
That has a huge impact, and he'll forever have my love for that. And it's funny. Well, my mom died when I was 12 years old, and I will say something for she was not a science fiction person, and the one science fiction movie that won her over was The Terminator. Like, I remember watching The Terminator with her. And so Cameron also has a little bit of, like, he got my mom to like a science fiction movie. I know it was the romance.
Right.
Or whatever, but like, that was the one science fiction movie that she watched with me. She was like, well, that was kind of good. That and Starman. She likes Starman.
Okay.
And so I have those two, and so I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I get that, and my criticisms of Cameron are not related to any of his films directly. They are related to what I consider to be his lack of moral character, and so it's perfectly okay to enjoy one of his movies as far as I'm concerned. And as I tend to remind people who come after me when I say the things that I say, I have no power to make you not go and watch a movie that you want to see.
Right.
I have none whatsoever. You disagree with me? Disagree with me. Go and enjoy your movie.
Hey, listen, I am a big fan. I mean, Maltzberg is one of my favorites. I like grumpy old science fiction opinions. So I appreciate them. So, you know, anyways, Steve, you're doing amazing work, keeping amazing stories alive.
Thank you very
No pun
much.
intended. And I'm interested to see where Kermit takes it, and I'm sure we'll talk to him at some point on the podcast too about that direction, because I think that's really important. Let's keep the history of this genre alive and keep people studying it. So on that note, closing out the podcast is always my hardest part. I had the hardest time ending. So but thank you, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll talk soon, and people can find amazing stories at amazingstories.com.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you very much for joining us, everybody.
A URL I had to pay way too much money for, by the way.
Yikes.
Somebody else had it parked.
All right. Well, you got it now.
Yep.
So, all right, folks.
Thank you again.
Thanks for joining us.